You criticize yourself more harshly than anyone else ever could. The voice in your head dissects your failures, magnifies your inadequacies, reminds you of every moment you fell short of who you wanted to be. And you have been taught to silence this voice, to treat it as dysfunction, to medicate it or affirm it away. But what if that voice is not your enemy? What if it is speaking a language you have never learned to decode? Friedrich Nietzsche understood something most people miss entirely. Your inner critic is not attacking you at random. It is revealing the exact shape of your unrealized potential. Every judgment you make against yourself is a confession of what you value most deeply. Every moment of self-criticism is a map pointing directly toward who you are trying to become. Most people experience their inner critic as pure negativity, as something that diminishes them, that keeps them small and afraid. But Nietzsche saw self-criticism as a fundamentally creative force. He understood that you cannot judge yourself for being weak unless you hold an ideal of strength. You cannot feel shame about your cowardice unless you value courage. You cannot feel inadequate about your work unless you have a vision of excellence that matters to you. The inner critic does not arise from nowhere. It arises from the gap between who you are and who you believe you should be. And that gap is not a wound. It is a direction. You have spent years trying to quiet this voice. You have practiced self-compassion, repeated affirmations, surrounded yourself with people who tell you that you are enough exactly as you are. And perhaps some of that has been necessary. Perhaps you needed relief from the constant assault of your own judgment. But relief is not the same as transformation. Comfort is not the same as growth. And what Nietzsche recognized is that the inner critic is not trying to destroy you. It is trying to forge you into something greater than you currently are. It is the voice of your highest self, frustrated by the compromises of your actual behavior. When you tell yourself you are lazy, you are not simply being cruel. You are acknowledging that you hold an ideal of discipline, of effort, of meaningful work. When you judge yourself for being afraid, you are revealing that you value courage, that you believe there is something worth risking yourself for. When you feel ashamed of your mediocrity, you are confessing that excellence matters to you, that you have a vision of what you could create if you stopped settling. The content of your self-criticism is a precise inventory of your values. And most people never realize this. They experience the pain of judgment without ever asking what that judgment is protecting, what it is pointing toward, what it is demanding you become. Nietzsche called this self-overcoming. It is the fundamental human drive to transcend your current limitations, to become more than you are, to refuse the comfort of remaining static. But self-overcoming is impossible if you treat your inner critic as pathology. If you silence it, if you medicate it, if you affirm it away, you lose access to the only compass that can guide you toward your own transformation. The inner critic knows what you are capable of. It knows what you are avoiding. It knows the difference between your potential and your performance, and it will not stop speaking until you start listening. This is not about embracing cruelty. It is not about wallowing in shame or using self-hatred as motivation. Nietzsche was not interested in suffering for its own sake. He was interested in suffering that produces meaning, in pain that catalyzes transformation. The inner critic becomes destructive only when you refuse to hear what it is actually saying. When you interpret its message as you are worthless, you miss the real communication. The real message is always, you are capable of more than this. You judge yourself for wasting time because you know somewhere beneath your conscious awareness that your life is finite and that how you spend it matters. You criticize yourself for being selfish because you hold an ideal of generosity, of contribution, of living in a way that serves something beyond your immediate comfort. You feel inadequate in your relationships because you have a vision of intimacy, of presence, of showing up fully for the people you care about. None of this is dysfunction. All of it is aspiration wearing the mask of judgment. The problem is that you have been conditioned to see only the mask. You have been taught that self-criticism is the voice of your parents, your culture, your trauma. And sometimes it is. Sometimes the inner critic is simply repeating messages that were installed in you by people who did not understand you, who projected their own failures onto you, who needed you to be small so they could feel large. But even then, even when the critic's voice carries the tone of someone else's judgment, the content it focuses on reveals what you care about. You do not internalize criticism about things that do not matter to you. You internalize criticism about things that strike at the core of your identity, your values, your vision of who you want to be. Nietzsche believed that the highest human beings are those who can turn their suffering into fuel for creation, who can take the raw material of their inadequacy and transform it into the blueprint for their development. This is not positive thinking. It is not reframing. It is recognition. It is the discipline of asking, what does this judgment reveal about what I value? What does this criticism tell me about who I am trying to become? What would I have to change? What would I have to develop? What would I have to overcome in order to silence this voice, not by suppressing it, but by embodying what it demands? When you judge yourself for lacking courage, you are being shown that courage is a value you must cultivate. When you criticize yourself for being dishonest, you are being directed toward integrity. When you feel ashamed of your weakness, you are being called towards strength. The inner critic is not random. It is precise. It targets exactly the areas where you are living beneath your own standards, and those standards are not arbitrary. They are the architecture of your ideal self. Most people reject this idea because it feels like giving permission to be cruel to yourself. They worry that if they listen to the inner critic, they will be consumed by it, that they will spiral into self-hatred and paralysis. But this misunderstands the relationship Nietzsche is describing. He is not saying you should obey the critic's tone. He is saying you should decode its content. The tone is often harsh, often unforgiving, often contaminated by past wounds and internalized voices. But the content, the specific areas it targets, the particular failures it highlights, these are your roadmap. You cannot overcome yourself if you do not first know what you are trying to overcome. You cannot grow if you refuse to acknowledge where you are stuck. You cannot become who you are capable of being if you spend all your energy pretending you are already there. The inner critic strips away your delusions. It forces you to confront the gap between your actions and your values. And that confrontation is unbearable only if you believe the gap should not exist. But the gap is supposed to exist. The gap is what drives you forward. The gap is what makes growth possible. Nietzsche understood that comfort is the enemy of transformation. When you are comfortable, when you are satisfied, when you believe you have arrived, you stop growing. You stop questioning. You stop pushing against your limitations. The inner critic is the voice that refuses to let you settle. It is the voice that will not allow you to become complacent. It is the voice that insists you are capable of more, even when more is painful, even when more requires you to sacrifice the version of yourself you have grown attached to. This is why self-compassion, as it is commonly taught, often fails to produce real change. It soothes the pain without addressing the cause. It tells you that you are enough without asking what enough means, without examining whether your current way of being is actually aligned with your deepest values. Nietzsche would say that you are not enough, not because you are fundamentally flawed, but because you are fundamentally unfinished. You are a work in progress, and the inner critic is the part of you that knows this, that refuses to pretend otherwise, that demands you keep working. When you begin to see your self-criticism as a map rather than an attack, everything changes. You stop being at war with yourself. You stop trying to silence the voice or drown it out with affirmations. Instead, you start asking questions. What is this judgment trying to protect? What value am I betraying when I act this way? What would I have to become in order to live in alignment with what I actually believe matters? These questions are not comfortable. They do not produce instant relief, but they produce clarity. And clarity is the foundation of transformation. You judge yourself for being passive because you value agency. You criticize yourself for being dependent because you value autonomy. You feel ashamed of your inauthenticity because you value truth. The inner critic is not trying to destroy these values. It is trying to enforce them. It is trying to push you toward the life you claim to want but keep avoiding. And it becomes vicious only when you ignore it, only when you pretend the gap does not exist, only when you refuse to take responsibility for closing it. Nietzsche believed that the human being is the only animal capable of making promises to itself about what it will become. You are not fixed. You are not determined by your past or your conditioning. You are a project, an ongoing act of creation. And the inner critic is the voice of that project, reminding you of the promises you made to yourself, holding you accountable to the vision you once had before fear and comfort convinced you to compromise. This does not mean every criticism is valid. Some of your self-judgment is simply noise, simply the echo of voices that were never yours to begin with. But even that noise clusters around your real values. Even distorted criticism reveals what matters to you. The work is not to eliminate the critic. The work is to refine it, to separate the signal from the noise, to identify which judgments are pointing you toward growth and which are simply repeating old wounds. When you criticize yourself for not speaking up, You are being shown that you value courage and authenticity. When you judge yourself for avoiding difficulty, you are being directed toward discipline and resilience. When you feel inadequate in your creative work, you are being called toward mastery. None of this is pathology. All of it is aspiration. And if you can hear it that way, if you can translate the language of judgment into the language of values, you gain access to the most powerful tool for self-transformation you will ever have. Nietzsche said that what does not kill you makes you stronger. But he did not mean that suffering itself is strengthening. He meant that suffering, when consciously engaged, when used as information rather than avoided as pain, becomes the raw material for growth. Your inner critic is suffering. It is the pain of the gap between who you are and who you could be. And that pain is not something to escape. It is something to mine for meaning, to interrogate for direction, to follow like a thread toward your own becoming. Most people spend their entire lives running from this voice. They numb it with distraction, with substances, with constant activity. They surround themselves with people who will never challenge them, who will always validate their current state. They build lives designed to avoid confronting their own potential. And they die having never asked what they were actually capable of, having never tested themselves against their own ideals, having never allowed the inner critic to do its work of transformation. But you do not have to live that way. You can choose to listen. You can choose to decode the criticism instead of simply enduring it. You can ask, what is this voice protecting? What does it want me to become? What would I have to sacrifice? What would I have to risk? What would I have to develop in order to embody the values it is enforcing? These are not easy questions. The answers will demand things from you. They will require you to change, to grow, to give up the comfortable story you tell yourself about why you are the way you are. But this is the only path to self-overcoming. This is the only way to become more than you are. Not by silencing the critic, not by affirming yourself into stagnation, but by using the pain of your own judgment as a compass. By following it toward the qualities you most need to develop. By treating it as the voice of your highest self, frustrated by your current limitations, demanding that you rise. Your inner critic knows who you could be. It has always known. And it will not stop speaking until you start becoming that person. Not perfectly, not all at once, but deliberately, consciously, with the understanding that every moment of self-judgment is an invitation to close the gap between your reality and your ideals. That is not cruelty. That is love. The kind of love that refuses to let you settle. The kind of love that sees your potential and will not allow you to waste it. The kind of love that transforms judgment into direction, shame into fuel, inadequacy into aspiration. This is what Nietzsche meant by self-overcoming. Not the erasure of your flaws, but the conscious use of your awareness of those flaws as the foundation for growth. Your inner critic is not your enemy. It is the voice of who you are becoming, calling you forward. And if you can learn to listen, if you can learn to translate its language, you will discover that it has been guiding you all along.